Hey everyone, welcome back to Beyond Nihility. In this video, we are going to be continuing with our Brush Studio settings. So far, we have covered from stroke path till grain. Continuing with the Brush Studio, we have rendering and wet mix next. In this video, we're going to discuss about those two attributes. Rendering is basically how your layer of paint reacts with another layer of paint. So under rendering, you have two of the main attributes, sub-attributes. One is rendering mode and the second is blending. So under rendering mode, if you can see, there are basically two subcategories. One is the first four which come under the glaze and the last two which come under blending itself. So if I have to say one line about glaze and blending, glaze is something that deals with paints that are more diluted, that are more wet, and blending is something that deals with sort of like thick paint effect. In order to demonstrate this, I'm going to be taking two different colors. First, I'm going to clear the drawing pad, I'm going to increase the preview size, and I'm going to be taking two layers of paint. There's one layer. And probably there's another layer. Let's also take another layer of paint with a different color. In order to see the proper difference, make sure you set the opacity to max under your Apple Pencil settings. And coming back to rendering, the first one is light glaze. So light glaze is something like more water and less paint. So the paint is kind of very diluted. So if you can see, I've set the rendering mode to light glaze now. And if you can see, the paint is more diluted. It's almost as if the paint has no pigment in it. The next one is uniform glaze. I did come across several videos and even the Procreate handbook which says that this is something which is similar to the effect that you get in Adobe Photoshop. Now personally, I have not tried Photoshop, so I would not be able to comment on that. But what I can see that is this gives a slightly more intense effect as compared to the glaze. I'm not sure if you'll be able to notice it on the camera, but I can see that the paints are a little bit more dark now. That means the pigment is starting to show up. Next we have intense glaze. So as soon as I clicked, you can see that the pigment of the colors has increased quite a lot. So intense glaze gives sort of like more intensity, like intensity. Yeah, that's what. Next we have something called as heavy glaze. Now this will be a little more intense as compared to the intense glaze. But there's one thing that I could notice in heavy glaze, that is it still kind of retains that opacity that is there between two colors. Whereas if I set it to intense glaze, I can see that some areas of this overlapping between the two paints, it's sort of like invisible. But if I do set it to heavy glaze, I can see that they are getting overlapped here. I'm not sure if it'll be noticeable on the camera. So those are the four rendering modes that are under the glaze category. Next we have something called blending. So blending deals with a slightly thicker version of the paint. First you have uniform blending, which again, as the Procreate handbook says, it's something similar to the one you have in Adobe Photoshop, but as I've never tried that one before, I would not be able to comment on that. But from what I can see, it is still sort of remaining that wet mix effect, but it's also giving a lot more pigment for the colors. Next you have intense blending, which is the highest level of rendering mode here. If you set it to intense blending, it's almost as if you're laying just thick amount of paint on top of each other. So it sort of completely covers the layer of paint that is there behind each stroke if laid on top of each other. So those were the rendering modes. Now coming to blending, you do have a couple of settings over here. The first one being the flow itself. So flow is something that will determine how much paint should come out of your pencil. So if you set it to max, that means you want the maximum pigment and the maximum paint to flow through your pencil. I would recommend to set it to max because there are always other options like opacity and stuff like that where you can actually change how much of that paint should be visible. But if you want to create something like a blending brush or something, then this flow would be really helpful if you know how much value to set it. Now next setting that you have is wet edges. So wet edges is something that will give an effect if you have a paint on your paintbrush and if you just drop a bit of paint from your paintbrush, you can notice that the pigment sort of goes and collects over the edges. So wet edges is something that will bring that particular effect to your brushes in Procreate. So you can see that if I set the wet edge to none, obviously there's no effect, but if I increase the wet edges, you can see that there's a lot more pigment at the edges of my stroke as compared to the middle. So the next setting that you have is burnt edges. So burnt edges is something that will affect only the edges of your stroke and not the center part of your stroke. So if you increase the burnt edges percentage over here, it sort of gives that color burn effect. It makes the paint a little more dark at the edges where the colors are overlapping. You can see that the blue stroke over here is kind of like very dark at the edges. Same goes to this color as well. You also have burnt edges mode where you can set different modes to see different effects to your edges. Now these different modes are something that I'm still trying to figure out, and I will be making a detailed video on each modes over here once I figure out completely how different these are from each other. Now while burnt edges mode will only apply these different modes to only your edges, blend mode is something that will apply to overall strokes of your brush. You can set it to different values to sort of notice that effect they have on each other. Now, as I said earlier, I'm still trying to explore how different these are from each other. Once I'm able to figure out how all these modes work, I'll be making a detailed video, as I did come across several videos online on explaining each of these blend modes, but none of them explained it in detail as it would be quite complex to explain. So I'm still trying to figure out a way to explain these concepts clearly, and I also didn't want it to give out half information, so you may have to stay tuned until then. Next, you have something called luminance blending. Now if you have this toggle switched off, then the different rendering modes and the blending modes, they sort of work on the color value itself, that is the hue and saturation. But if you turn on the luminance blending, then these will work based on the brightness or the lightness. I do understand that these are way too technical and sort of really hard to understand or even explain on how different these are from each other. So do not worry, I do feel you. At the end of the day, what matters most is the result itself, and nobody is asking us to write a 10-minute essay on what these rendering modes are, right? So it's totally alright to not get a lot of things, but having a basic understanding of what these modes do will really help you if you're trying to create a new brush or add different effects to your existing brushes. That sums up the rendering. Now just remember that rendering is something wherein you sort of decide on how your brush stroke interacts with another brush stroke, or even the colors for that matter. So the next property or the attribute that we have is wet mix. Now wet mix is something that's really important if you're trying to create watercolor brushes or watercolor blending brushes, as all the properties in here control how much water should be there, how much paint should be there in each of your brush strokes. So let's try understanding each of these settings. So before we begin to understand each of these settings, it would be a great idea to change the shape of our brush as well as the grain. So I'm going to go over here to shape and click on the shape editor, and I'll try to import something from the source library of the Procreate. This particular shape seems like it would be a nice example to show. So I'm going to pick this water bleed and I'll click on done. Now it's time to change the grain of this. Now since that was something that was related with water, now I do want to select my grain to sort of mimic that watercolor paper. So I'll try to find something similar to that in the source library again. So there's something called as wet paper, so I think this will be perfect. Now before continuing, I'll also try to increase the opacity under Apple Pencil so you'll be able to notice the clear difference. Now coming back to wet mix, the first setting that we have is dilution. So dilution is something that will help you determine how much water you need in your paint. If you increase the dilution, it means that you want more water than the pigment itself. As you can see, as and when I increase the dilution, the pigment is sort of reducing and the amount of water on the canvas is increasing. This will be really helpful in case if you are trying to create brushes that mimic the actual watercolor effect. For now, I'll keep the dilution to somewhere around 45 to 50. That should be okay. And the reason I'm setting it to some value is because all the settings under wet mix sort of interact with each other. So if you set one setting to a particular value, the other settings behave accordingly. And that's the reason why I'm setting the dilution to some amount. Now the next two settings that we have, charge and attack, they sort of produce the same result but from different perspective. And when I say perspective, I mean the perspective from the pencil as well as the perspective from the canvas. So charge is something that will help you determine how much paint your pencil should retain while laying out strokes. So in traditional watercolor, if you dip the pencil in a watercolor paint and if you draw a stroke, as soon as you lay the brush, there will be more paint, and as in when you drag the brush around your canvas, the amount of paint that is there in your brush reduces. If you set it to lesser value, that means you do not want your brush to hold much of that paint. But if you set it to higher values, it means that you want that nice pigment on your brush for a longer period of time, as in when you draw strokes across your canvas. Now I'll set the charge to somewhere again around 50 and we'll jump on to the next setting. The next setting that we have is attack. Now as I said, since charge works from pencil's perspective on how much paint should come out of the pencil, attack is something that works from the perspective of canvas. It will help you determine how much paint your canvas should hold. Think of it like different GSM papers that you get. The higher the GSM of the paper, the more paint it will be able to hold, and attack is something that will work in a similar way. If you do set it to higher values, you can see that the pigment is sort of increasing over here. Next you have something called as pull. So pull is something that will help you determine how much your paint should be smeared across the canvas when you're drawing a stroke. For example, here before setting any pull, my stroke here is kind of very clear. I'm able to see the pattern of the canvas pretty clear. But when I increase the pull, you can see that the paint is sort of smearing off. So this will basically help the brush to sort of pull that paint that is already laid on the canvas. Before we move on to the next setting, let's set pull to some value again, because this will affect how the grade works like. So grade is something that will sort of bring a little bit of contrast to your brush strokes. If you turn off the pull entirely, you won't be able to notice much of the change in grade. You need pull to be set to some value in order to notice a little bit of difference in the grade. Now before we move on to the next setting, let's set grade to some value for about 52%. And then let's move on to the blur. So blur is something that will give the exact blurry effect to your brush stroke. If I increase the blur, you can see that the texture that I had previously set is almost invisible now and everything is sort of blurred out. If you reduce the blur value, there won't be much of that blur. Now, since you have set some pull, you can see that the paint is still smeared on, but there's no overall blurry effect to the brush. If you set the blur to some value, you'll be able to see that blurry effect across the stroke. Next you have blur jitter. Blur jitter is something that will sort of give that random effect of blurriness between each of your stamps that make up your stroke. If you set the blur jitter to maximum, it means that at some points the amount of blur that is there will be maximum, and at some stamps the amount of blur that is there would be reduced. Next you have wetness jitter. So wetness jitter is something that adds randomness to the wetness itself. That means at some stamps you do have more water, but at some stamps the paint will look much more thicker. So that is all we have in rendering and wet mix. Now if you remember, I did try to create a video where I implemented the features that we discussed in grain to create a gold foil brush. So likewise we are going to create one watercolor brush and a blending brush using these two attributes that we studied today in a next video. So stay tuned for that video. And with that being said, if you're finding this Procreate tutorials helpful, please let me know in the comment section. That will motivate me to do more videos like this. If you have downloaded my gold foil brush, please comment gold so I'll know how many of you have downloaded the brush and are using it. It's just a nice motivational factor to keep making more free brushes for you guys. So that's all we have for this particular video. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care. Bye bye.